Assalamu alaikum and a very good evening to all of you. Thank you so much for being here, taking out time to be with us. I am Tayyaba Tamim from the School of Education and Plans, and this is the first talk of the series, Inclusive Education, Building Inclusive Educational Environments. And this one over here today, we are very privileged to have with us Dr. Arathi Sriprakash. She's professor of education at University of Bristol, and she has been doing a lot of work on racial politics of knowledge in education and in international development. Thank you so much for being with us, Arathi. Thank you so much for taking out the time. It's over to you. You have 20 to 25 minutes to present, and then we'll open up the floor for question and answers. Over to you, Arathi.
Thank you so much, Taiba, and also to Hamna for organising me in this event. It's my absolute pleasure to be here today, and thank you to everyone who's come. Especially at this time, we've been thinking. I'm speaking from the UK, from Bristol, the city of Bristol, and we have been reading in the news a lot about the difficult circumstances facing many in Pakistan at the moment. So our thoughts are certainly with you there. I just wanted to start by saying that the title of my talk, Whiteness and the Politics of Education, has come from, I suppose, what is the central theme of a new book that has just been published by Pluto Press. This is the cover of the book. And it's been written alongside, so I've written this with my colleagues Sophie Rudolph and Jessica Gerard at the University of Melbourne. So it's very much collaborative thinking and collaborative work. So I wanted to acknowledge Sophie and Jessica's contributions to this talk as well. So just to give you a sense of our starting concern of the book, why we were motivated, in fact, moved to write it, is that we were, very much aware that there are these systems of racial domination that prevail across the world. But even despite their ubiquity, despite their pervasiveness, it's really important to remember that these systems are not pre-given and they're not natural. Rather, they are forged and sustained in social and political life, right? So the question is, these are not natural systems. Racial hierarchies are not the natural order of the world, but they are made. They are created, and they are sustained. And key to our thinking here is that they are also relayed. They are passed on through generations. So really, the catchphrase of our book is that whiteness, as a particular system of racial domination, is not innate, but it is learned. It is relayed, passed on, it is taught. So in thinking about this, we started to really delve into what kinds of analytical frameworks we can use to understand more fully this process of learning whiteness. And we're really seeing this as the politics of education. So it's these analytical frameworks that I'm going to present to you today. I will be drawing on the case studies that we focus on in the book, which is focused primarily on the Australian case. And perhaps you can hear from my accent, I originally hail from Australia. But the broader context that we are looking at is, in fact, British colonialism. So I'm hoping that those who are here today can help us, generate some links about how these ideas might resonate with the specific educational systems and practices that you would be familiar with in Pakistan. So as particularly in terms of reflecting on the themes of this series of talks around building inclusive educational environments. Okay, so as I mentioned, our analysis is very much rooted in a sort of an analysis of the histories and enduring formations of British settler colonialism. If we think about this, and this is where it's a different case to Pakistan in the sense that Australia is a settler colony. So the structures of colonial domination were somewhat different to non-settler colonial forces. But thinking about the specific forces of settler colonialism in Australia, they are not over. In fact, they are enduring. They endure to this day. And that's a key analytic that we bring to the work of understanding that colonialism is not something that's in the past, but its forms and configuration can endure until this day. So we look at this linking the project of British settler colonialism with the project of whiteness. So we see how whiteness has been written into the social and political structures in Australia. And we've been working with a range of scholars, including the Latin American decolonial theorist Maldonado Torres, who writes that coloniality is maintained alive in books, in the criteria for academic performance, in cultural patterns, in common sense, in the self-image of peoples, in aspirations of self. So even our own deepest sort of sense of ourselves is informed through a colonial lens, and so many other aspects of our modern experience. So this gets us thinking, how are the different ways in which these colonial frameworks endure today? We've also been inspired by the work of David Theo Goldberg, particularly his book, The Racial State. And here we've been trying to think more closely about the relationship between the state and education. And Goldberg's idea of the racial state is that the apparatus and technologies of modern states have served to fashion, modify, and reify the terms of racial expression, as well as racist exclusions and subjugations. He was very much, his key idea is the state is at once a racial state. It is actively involved in making, modifying, sustaining different kinds of racial expressions. Now that is, his analysis was in the US. We've thought about that in the Australian context, and I'm absolutely sure that it would be really relevant to think about in the Pakistani context too. And another kind of key idea of our thinking about colonialism not being over, and in fact it is enduring, is to think about the ways in which white domination accumulates over time, but also expands into different areas. And some of the reading that we've been doing using cultural theorists such as Helen Nyo and Sarah Ahmed is to think about the ways in which settler colonialism makes a home for whiteness and white ownership. And I'll talk a bit more about what I mean by white property and white ownership in a moment. But there is an idea that there is a kind of security and comfort and homeliness given to particular expressions of whiteness. And if you are operating outside of those expressions, then those are cause for instability or trouble or question. And the ways in which these occur are sometimes in quite kind of tacit ways, through the production of both kind of collective or social memories, as well as the things that we're willing to forget about our histories in a state. So we've been thinking really about the role of memory and amnesia in the making of states, and specifically the role of education. If you think about what gets remembered or put into school curricula, what gets forgotten in the story that children are told about the nation, right? Okay. But perhaps, having told you a bit about the works that have inspired us, perhaps kind of key book, then I really recommend everyone to read this, because it has opened up a really new thinking in the field of Indigenous studies, and I think it ought to be read by educationalists far and wide. And it is by an Australian Indigenous scholar, Eileen Morton Robinson, and it's called The White Possessive: Property, Power and Indigenous Sovereignty. And I suppose, there's many really informative arguments made in this book, but I think perhaps what's key for me to relay to you here today is that Morton Robinson says that foundational to the formation and the management of modern settler colonial states is the perpetual disavowal of Indigenous sovereignty and the active construction of the nation as a white possession. And we can see this through lots of different ways. I mean, if I were to ask you to imagine Australia, you would probably, one of the images that would come up is you would think of Australia as a white nation, when in fact, Indigenous sovereignty has never been ceded. Australia's the land on which this nation of Australia is imagined is Aboriginal land, right? So we see how, you know, the kind of notions of white possession are not just local or national, these permeate globally. And so this is why we're hoping that this kind of analysis helps us to not only understand the specifics of, you know, the politics of education in Australia, but also how these educational messages, how learning whiteness, white normativity stretches across the globe. Okay. So in thinking, if I recap a little bit for you, we were thinking about the forces of British settler colonialism. We're thinking specifically about how white domination gets relayed and sustained. And we're interested in this idea of the racial state. So in our book, what we have been thinking about is the way in which the state has a pedagogic function. We call this the pedagogies of the state. And here we build on Jessica Pikett's work on the pedagogic state. And she says that this pedagogic state entails pedagogic strategies employed by the state as well as non-state agencies. So those who act in service of the maintenance of a particular state functioning, right? Both within and outside of the formal educational sphere in order to govern citizens, right? So actually, lots have been written around this theme. If you would think about citizenship education, I'm sure that there are scholars in the room who have been thinking about these similar terms, but we've latched on specifically to the idea that the state is pedagogic as a way to try to tune into its activeness. A pedagogy means there is action, there is a kind of interaction with citizens. So it's not just about what appears in the textbooks, but mapping these kind of interactions along multiple sites. So this is what we've put forward as the pedagogy of the state. So our analysis suggests that educational institutions such as schools and universities, as well as informal educational practices, including public discourse, media discourse, and so on, are part of the settler colonial apparatus. Education is a key mechanism of the Australian racial state in which whiteness is relayed and taught and learnt intergenerationally. And pedagogies of the settler colonial state are contested. So it's not to say this is a kind of one-way didacticism, which we are all, you know, receiving these messages without any critique. So these might be critiqued and contested, but ultimately these pedagogies of the state are intended to secure the permanence of settler colonialism in Australia. It is intended to perpetually disavow Indigenous sovereignty, as, you know, going back to Eileen Morton Robinson's work. So we see there's a kind of assumption about the future as always being a white possession here. And this is where we are trying to challenge, you know, well, what other visions of education might we have in a country, a so-called liberal democracy? Yeah. Okay. So how did we go about, you know, delving more deeply into these politics of education, particularly thinking about the way that the different pedagogic forms, okay, that can take place. In the book, we try to bring together 3 conceptual frames. But as you can see from this slide, there is perhaps opportunity for there to be more, right? These are perhaps not the only 3 ways of thinking about the politics of education. In fact, if anyone has any feedback or thoughts about how these ideas could be extended, that would be really wonderful to hear about. But the 3 conceptual frames we focus on are the materialities of education, the knowledges or the epistemic politics of education, and something that I've certainly come across more recently, so although my colleague Sophie Rudolph is an expert in this area, is the affective dimension. That is the kind of the ways in which education shores up and relays particular feelings about the state. Okay, so I'll try to move through this a little more quickly in the interest of time, but just to give you some examples of what we mean, right? So we expand on the idea of materialities using the concept of racial capitalism. This was a term that was first used by anti-apartheid activists in the 1970s, so in South Africa, but it is about thinking how issues of class inequality and racial inequality are interlocked. And it gets us particularly thinking about the ways in which populations, humanity indeed, is divided according to class/racial lines. And particularly if we think about the dynamics around the divided labor within education, it would be very interesting to hear from the Pakistan context, but in Australia, there is, first of all, an absence of, a relative absence of non-white teachers in the teaching force, but certainly in the area of Indigenous education, the hierarchies of labor are very clear, with Indigenous educators being seen as highly valuable in the teaching profession, but yet by and large occupying the relatively lower rungs of the teaching hierarchy. So there is an issue here about the division of labor and the hierarchic division of labor here. There's also, we also talk about the issues around school choice and the ways in which the education system itself filters certain students away from kind of public local schools and into elite private schools, and the kind of racial patterns that are involved in this. So our key argument is that education not only produces inequalities, but the system itself, thinking back to the theme of your series here about building systems that are inclusive, the system itself of education is premised on hierarchy and inequality, right? So it's what goes into the system is also unequal, not just what comes out of the system. And this is what we try to get our heads around through the concept of racial capitalism. The picture that's on here, I just want to tell you a very quick story to give you a concrete example. One of the ways you can understand how the system is so unequal in Australia is to follow the debates around school funding. Now, it was under a previous Conservative government in Australia that there was a requirement for schools to build a flagpole and fly the Australian flag in order to access government funds. So the kind of gestures towards nationalism, a kind of, putting up the Australian flag, but not perhaps the Aboriginal flag alongside it, accepting the white possession, accepting the British colonial project, was tied to the very kind of material access that schools had to do their work, to do their core business, right? So that became a really interesting site where you see the pedagogy of the state working through, well, you have to do this if you want to get your resources, right? So that was one example. Let me move to the next one. And this is where we talk about the epistemic politics of education. And we were particularly inspired by the work of the philosopher Charles Mills, and I highly recommend you read his work. I'll put it on there's a reference slide at the end, which I can show you. So Charles Mills writes about the epistemologies of white ignorance. And the key thing here is that we often think about ignorance, the idea of ignorance as lacking knowledge, as an absence of knowledge or a silence of knowledge or something like that, right? But he flips this around and he says, actually, to produce ignorance, there is an activeness involved. We must actively blindfold either ourselves or our students. We must actively withhold knowledge and information away. So he has this idea that ignorance has an epistemology, right? It's not just an absence of knowledge. There is something very active taking place. And so he specifically talks about white ignorance as an outcome of the colonial, the forces of colonial domination, okay, and the forces of white domination. So here he thinks about ignorance as being systemic because it emerges from these historical structures. And it's precisely through the production of ignorance that states, for example, can maintain and normalize racial hierarchies, right? So it's through the ignorance that we can, that is part of the pedagogy of the state, to withhold knowledge and understanding. Now, the most, obvious example of this perhaps is the curriculum debates that we see in schools. What should young people be learning in schools? What version of the national history might we be, or are we teaching our young people? What is being withheld from them? What perspectives are they being denied, and so on? Okay, and for what purpose? Okay, so again, this goes straight to the question of the politics of education. To give you a case from from Australia, this is a picture of Duan Hussein, who at the time was 12 years old, and he gave a speech to the United Nations. Now, he's a young Indigenous boy from Arent and Garawa country. And as part of his speech, he says, in school, they told me Captain Cook, so the British colonizer, said, in school, they told me Captain Cook was a hero and discovered Australia. It made me confused. It's not true, because before cars, buildings, and houses, they were just Aboriginal people. I want Australia to tell the truth that Aboriginal people were the first people who had the land. Now, he's a young Aboriginal boy who knows his history, but he's commenting on the systemic production of ignorance in the country. And this goes across so many different forms. It's not just about knowing our history, but also thinking about language. Now, another example I give to students quite frequently is that despite growing up in Australia, despite being schooled through the Australian system my entire life, I have not been taught any Indigenous language. I've only been taught English. So here again is a systemic withholding of knowledge and the systemic production of ignorance. And this is what we're arguing is a way in which education becomes complicit in sustaining whiteness. Okay, and the third idea, and I'll just mindful of time, is the idea of feelings. And we talk here about, we use the concept of feeling states, that feelings are generated towards and of the state, and these are produced and upheld in public and institutional spaces. So we're not all kind of neutral actors. There is a lot of affect, a lot of feeling that gets bound up in terms of the things that we're willing to protect and defend and become defensive about, and those things that we're wishing to pursue. So it's those kinds of very nuanced kind of tensions that we're trying to work through in the book. And we talk about the structures of the settlers' colonial state and the personal state of being with feeling. And both of these come together in both kind of backlash or defensiveness around our worldviews being challenged, as much as our projections of pride or belonging, indeed, as part of a country. And as I talked about before, about these ideas of homeliness and whiteness being at home, we argue that feelings are used to create a homeliness for whiteness, to normalize it, to make it the thing that we all desire. And one of the ways we reflect on this in terms of a concrete example is, if you can see these images on the slide. So Sophie, Jessica, and I, the three authors of this book, we all went through our primary schooling at the same time. And in 1988, we were all gifted from the state this silver medallion. It wasn't real silver, but a silver-colored medallion as a memento, as you can see, a memento for school students to celebrate the bicentennial. Now, what is the bicentennial? The bicentennial was a celebration, supposed celebration of 200 years of colonial invasion. 1788 was when Captain Cook arrived on the shores of Australia, and 200 years later we're still to kind of be having this kind of collective memory of what a fantastic moment this is in the country's history. We were drawn into that feeling state of having that pride and celebration by the kind of educational activities involved. So you can see here the picture. This is Sophie's little folder here, where we were asked to get all of our friends to autograph the folder in which the coin came in, as well as draw a picture of ourselves. We're literally inscribing ourselves into this memory of the state. Now, it's really important to remember that at this very moment in 1988, there were widespread protests led by Indigenous people, by Aboriginal people, saying, how can we celebrate invasion and the taking of our lands? This is not a moment of celebration. And in fact, asking us to think about that moment as not being a moment of colonization, but indeed invasion. Right. So I think that here we get an example of the ways and this is just one little example. Of course, schools are actively involved in these sorts of activities pedagogically, day in and day out. So we bring some analytic attention to feelings as well. So just to conclude then, I hope that giving you these ideas of how we've brought together the material, the epistemic, and the feelings, the affective dimensions, shows us that, what we might understand as inclusive education systems, or what we're calling, kind of unlearning whiteness, it demands a multidimensional approach. It can't be a kind of tokenistic or small scale sort of intervention that leaves the other aspects untouched. Having said that, though, we are not, we're really appreciative of all the work that is being done in the pockets where action can be taken, right? So it's not to dismiss those efforts too. And one of the key things that we think have really opened out important discussion in the Australian context, as well as in the British context that I am speaking to you from now, is the work around decolonizing the curriculum, to really think about those epistemic politics and how we might have a fuller, richer understanding of our past and present for students, so that it's not kind of apologizing for empire or perhaps normalizing systems of racial hierarchy, right? In fact, it's trying to undo those things, to make those seem questionable and open for critique, which is precisely what I think an anti-racist curriculum needs to do. So we're saying that it needs to have these multidimensional commitment. The book, in mapping these dimensions out, we're also trying to show the extensive reach and extensive power of whiteness and how it gets learnt in schools, in universities, and beyond. And something that I've been thinking about more and more as I give talks in different places is that what we've mapped here in terms of British settler colonialism is not only applicable to Australia, but the British colonial project was global, right? And so there will be elements of this story that I've told you, shared with you today, that I hope will resonate to your context. So, something that we've just started to think about, but I won't kind of delve into with any depth, because these are kind of in progress ideas and work that we're still writing on, is the role of reparations in all of this. I've been really thinking about how, in order to address the injustices of education systems, both past and present, we really need to ensure that those injustices aren't carried in to future systems. So there is a kind of reparative repair that needs to occur. We can't just progress as normal, assuming justice comes along the way. We must address those injustices in order to overcome them. So just to close, in that an idea of how we might unlearn whiteness might also be bound up with a reparative justice agenda. So I will stop there, but just to say thank you. Oh, I will put the resource reference. These are just some of the selected references that I mentioned. It's Charles Mills is the first one, the chapter on white ignorance in the book Race and Epistemologies of Ignorance that I found very powerful that I mentioned. But okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Arathi, for this excellent talk. Very insightful indeed. And I will invite everyone for questions. And by the time I get questions from others, I have a few questions of myself also. I was just wondering, I mean, thinking of whiteness in Pakistan, thinking of how whiteness is performed by the use of the English language, and how this divide between white and non-white performance, I would say, by this divide between private and public schools. So in private schools, you have this access to this language, this desire, this aspiration to be white by using a specific language and to align with them. So you did talk about how to unlearn whiteness, but could you also possibly talk about the challenges on the way as we try to unlearn this whiteness, specifically because this learning of whiteness, this learning of this symbolic dominance has its, has its benefits, because it is only by accepting the symbolic dominance that you succeed. So you get a good job, or, the more white you are seen, the better it is. So how do you start, I mean, I'm just saying, where do we begin? What are the challenges?
Yeah, I think, Tyra, that is the big tension here, right? Because we see the power of whiteness. It opens opportunity. It's allowed me, I mean, if I can be very frank, to a room full of 73 people who I haven't met in person, is, I have imbibed the lessons of whiteness from my own education in Australia, because that was the way you could, in terms of accent, in terms of habits, in terms of use of language, all of the things that you mentioned. And that opened doors in terms of my educational successes, my ability to move in workplaces, the labor market, and so on. So this is what gives whiteness power. But I suppose what we're trying to do here is say, if we are stepping back and we're educators thinking, how do we build just educational systems? Then surely part of that is addressing the injustices that continue to be carried through when we accept those that whiteness is power, right? So we're trying, I mean, it's not like there are any easy solutions. And in fact, we address that in the book. There are not easy solutions, but we have here a set of openings to say, how do we really configure our education systems? This might seem blue sky thinking, but the fact that we have an education system that year in, year out reproduces disadvantage and inequality means that something has to change, right? So I think we're trying to end with that hope that, okay, we don't have a 10-point plan of what needs to happen, but these are the things that need to be, worked on collectively.
Absolutely right. Thank you so much. So I have a question from Mavish Safar. Mavish, it's quite a long question. Why don't you come in and ask the question yourself? Mavish? Over to you.
Hello. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Tamim. And thank you so much, Dr. Sriprakash, for your very, very informative session. My question is pertaining to culturally or traditional historical paths of learning that exist in lands that have been, later, like you do have mentioned, either colonized as a settler colony or as a non-settler colony. So the question that I have is, do you believe that there is in place a selective process of elimination from participation for entire traditions of learning that are just relegated to alternate learning? They're hat-tipped, but like you mentioned, they're pushed down the hierarchy of learning. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you. Oh, what a lovely question. I mean, I gave the example before about why is it so that I have grown up my whole life in Australia and I don't speak an Indigenous language as an example, but we can also think of all the kinds of art forms, ways of living, ways of thinking that were completely excluded from my formal school curriculum. And I think it is because we have a hierarchy of knowledge. And so as soon as you were talking, I was thinking, yes, you know, the kind of crafts that get passed down from family to family, the artisan practices that are not seen as relevant when we are focused solely on issues of numeracy and literacy. Not to say that those are not important, but there is a question there about why some things make it into a school curriculum and others don't. Before we began this session, I was talking to Taya about a paper that Sophie and Jessica and I wrote called Knowledge and Racial Violence, where we go quite deeply into these curriculum politics. And one of the things we also argue, though, in that book is that, you know, education always has this tension. It is both hopeful because it expands opportunities, it opens horizons, all of those sorts of things, but it can also be violent in terms of excluding, erasing, and closing down knowledges. And so I think understanding those tensions and holding them together to confront them is something that, you know, we are continuing to do.
Thank you so much, Arathi. There is another question very similar again, and in it, Ramin is asking, so how do we in our classrooms go about to unlearn whiteness?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the teacher level, I've been thinking about this, right? At the teacher level, I've been really inspired with the decolonizing the curriculum movements, really, to think about what kinds of resources and perspectives can we offer our students so that they are engaged in a critical thinking around, you know, both what education itself is trying to do, you know, understanding that, sure, okay, people are interested in making sure they can have jobs to go to, making sure they have opportunities, but what are they carrying with them? Are they carrying unchecked the idea of racial hierarchies? This is where I think an anti-racist pedagogy and anti-racist curriculum, I think across, you know, South Asia, thinking the ideas of an anti-casteist education is so important to ensure that whatever opportunities are opened by education, that we are not as teachers allowing the reproduction of racist or casteist thinking.
Thank you so much, Arathi. There is another question, and Anya is asking, why is there so much shame attached to being indigenous? And it is considered to be a sense of superiority when you attach yourself to someone white, or whiteness. Yeah.
Where is this question?
It says Anya. I
might not be able to, because I'm interested in the use of the word shame, because actually I think you know, Indigenous people and Indigenous activists, certainly in Australia, have done an enormous amount of really important work in underscoring the importance of pride, of the pride in language, in, you know, really pride in Indigenous culture, because they've recognized that one of the key technologies of control by colonizers is to dismiss those languages and dismiss those cultures and to install shame. So shame itself becomes a tool of colonization to devalue your own self and your own histories, your own language, and all of that, right? So actually the response against that, the resistance to that, has come from Indigenous activists and Indigenous communities. It hasn't necessarily come from schools, because schools are, as we are arguing, in service of the settler colonial state, right? They are valuing other kinds of knowledges and other kinds of cultures. So we have to learn from elsewhere to see those profound projects of reclaiming and reasserting Aboriginal pride as a way of reaffirming humanity itself.
Thank you so much. Arathi, Anusha has raised her hand. Anusha, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. Thank you so much for such an incredible and super insightful session. Really enjoyed it. I really appreciate, what really stood out to me also in the talk was that you mentioned that unlearning whiteness is a multidimensional approach. And this just got me thinking that media has an important role to play also when it comes to unlearning whiteness. And this just got me wondering that, and would love to know your thoughts on this. Why do you think that the mainstream media reports individual or interpersonal cases of racism far more than systematic and institutionalized forms of racial injustice? Why do you think that's the case?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we look a little bit at the role that media and particularly kind of sort of industry and think tank organizations have in influencing the political discourse of education in Australia. And I think you're right in that, you know, what would happen if those industries and those institutions really focused on the structural aspects is that they would see how complicit we all are, right? But it's very easy to target an individual as if they are an outlier, as if they're an aberration of what is actually a systemic problem. So I do think that there is a real problem in how, you know, particularly powerful media organizations and think tank institutes in Australia are distracting us and detracting from the real problem. We also see that the media and these think tanks are quite powerful sites of backlash to efforts to rethink curriculum. So to give you an example, there has been a lot of backlash against efforts to decolonize the curriculum, so much so that there has been active investment in programs called Studies of Western Civilization in Australia, in a way to reclaim, as if it had been lost, the importance of you know, Euro-modernity in the story of the nation. And so, and there is material investment here, and this is why the dimension of materialities is important, to follow the money, right? To see that there are, you know, millionaire benefactors to set up research institutes into Western civilization in Australian universities. So that has been something that I think, you know, we need to really be thinking about, you know, where the resourcing for these ideas occur and why.
Thank you so much. There are two questions over here, one by, and I'll come to you, Anna, in a minute. So I have this question by Awais, and he wants to know a little bit more about the reparative action in unlearning whiteness that you're thinking of. So he wants to know, who would you hold responsible? Where would we go? What are the things that are in your mind? And then there is a very interesting question next to it when we can answer both of them together. And there is again Mavish, and she's asking about this question of Amrita Singh's capability approach. When we think of our, you know, opportunities to achieve our valued goals. Now, if our valued goals themselves are somehow embedded in these ideas of superiority of whiteness and being white, so this, I mean, how do we go about it? Over to you.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I guess, I mean, are you talking about adaptive preferences here from Sen's? Right. I mean, that is a really cool question, because I hadn't married up those two kind of concepts. But yeah, if we're thinking, okay, we need to like perpetuate these systems, these systems of racial domination, because we need them. We need to succeed via them. Is that akin to adaptive preferences? My hunch is yes, we can think that those ideas are related. I would love for someone to kind of flesh that out and write on that a bit more, because I think that's probably taking Sen's approach in a direction that hasn't been taken before. So if you are working on the capability approach and thinking about these things, there's a really neat area of inquiry, and please do share it with me if you end up writing on that. That's great. Oh yeah, sorry.
Awais question about reparations.
Reparations, yeah, I was just getting, okay, so I'm trying to find that, because it was how do you know who to hold responsible for reparations? This is a really interesting question. I think a lot of moral philosophers who have been writing about reparative justice have been really concerned, I would say overly concerned, about who is responsible, as if these, it individualizes the problem, right? What I would prefer to see in the debates about reparation is a collective discussion around, okay, can we collectively recognize the injustices of the past and present, even if we've benefited from them, even, whether you've benefited from them or whether you have been harmed by those injustices, can we agree that these injustices have existed? First step, right? So this idea of recognition. Now, how does that occur? I would say education plays a huge role in that. This is where I think the decolonizing the curriculum moves are so powerful, in fact, right? Because can we actually better understand our history and its harms? So if we've come to collectively recognize it, then is the question that me as an individual needs to shoulder the burden of reparation as an individual, as a morally responsible agent? Well, this is where I think the argument becomes individualistic. In contrast, we could think, well, if a group, if the collective has collectively benefited from those injustices, then aren't they responsible by virtue of the advantages they hold, right? Not because of who they are. So I think this also gets us away from, I would say, kind of binary group identities that can slip in here, because that becomes shaky foundation. If we are splitting the world up into individuals of, haves and have-nots, then that becomes shaky ground from which to build a kind of collective and just future, right? So I've spoken in very kind of abstract ways about reparation, in part because I'm still working out my ideas on that, having done a bit of reading now in political moral philosophy, thinking about its application to education. But if I can just sort of park it there for the moment and say, please come back to me at some other point where I hope that I have my ideas more firm. I am writing about this now, so in a few months, I hope you'll see some writing that comes out into the world. So, yeah.
So we have Amna over here. Amna Asif, would you like to go ahead and ask a question?
Sure. Hi. I was just wondering, this is probably more of a reflection rather than a question. So I'm originally from New Zealand. So in terms of, I think, education in comparison to Australia, even though there's inequality outside of education, probably in all facets in terms of, in comparison to the indigenous population there as well. But I think within education, a lot of the indigenous culture is more woven into the curriculum and kind of taught, as well as I think Maori being also taught as a language, as I think it's compulsory now, even though there is some pushbacks on that as well. And what do you think is the differences might be in the way that they implement that into the curriculum within New Zealand, especially in education, in comparison to the way that it's more acceptable and knowledgeable within the mainstream in comparison to Australia?
Yeah. So I'm not an expert on New Zealand history or politics or education for that matter, Amna, but so please correct me if I'm wrong. But my understanding is that the Maori population has been able to actually, through treaty, being able to have their knowledges and cultures and languages recognized and be part of the political and social infrastructure of the country. So that has meant that there are kind of both ways education system, Maori language education system, and it's permeated right through schools and universities. As you say, I don't think it's without its problems or its limitations, and I know that there are backlashes for sure. But I think perhaps the difference is that if there has been treaty, like a political statement of treaty, that gives a platform for those other reforms to occur. In Australia, there has been no treaty between Aboriginal people and the settler colonial state. So the settler colonial state remains a state built on stolen land. It's an illegitimate state in that sense because there's been no recognition of Indigenous sovereignty or Indigenous prior ownership officially, right? So you actually have this great lie on which everything else gets built upon. Right?
Okay, thank you very much.
So I have another question, and I think people are constantly thinking how to go about it. So there was this, but before I ask the question, I think Dr. Shazia Khan is here. Dr. Shazia, you can go ahead, Dr. Khan, and then I'll ask Rabia's question later. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Tamim, for giving up your space. Hi, Dr. Sriprakash. I'm Shazia, and I am with the School of Education. I am Dr. Tamim's colleague, and this is my first year at LUMS. And before that, I've lived in different parts of the world, and right now I am in Canada. That's where the family is. So a lot of it resonated as you were talking about it, and I was like, hell yes, hell yes, hell yes. That's what I was doing. But there were two things that stood out from your conversation to me that I think can be relatable to the context of Pakistan. And then I have a question. So two things. One, what goes into the system creates that inequity that comes out from the system. So that was very profound. We cannot just complain about the inequities of the system while we ignore what we are putting in. And the second thing that stood out to me was the ignorance as an epistemology with active dynamics. So I was just hoping if you could advise this group of like very wonderful students who are coming to know about these ideas, that when we are talking about language, we're not saying give up everything that you feel is wrong and pick up something else. Because I feel like in Pakistan, there is this, this kind of spectrum where English is not a good language. And then there is, in the name of religion, society, students are actually put in these Urdu medium schools or, but at the same time, there is an exclusion that's happening at the back. I always try to go by what one of the educational reformists that I think in the history of Pakistan, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, when he said that use English as the language of knowledge because you need to know what's going on. Because unless you know what's going on, you won't be able to find your position in how you are being probably one of those who are either in privilege or you are the one who are being excluded. So it's kind of that raising awareness. I was just hoping if you could kind of, and I think it's, I don't know what if that's what Dr. Tamim was going to say, that where to go about from here, not kind of raising the flag against, you know, things that we have come familiar with, but raising awareness. It's kind of that fine line between being aware to knowing what's happening and how to change and transform that. Like, how do we do that? So yeah, just that. And I see some of my students are in here too, and we will have these conversations in class as well, but just if you could. I'm sorry for the long-winded comment.
No, thank you, Shazia. So I just, sorry if my keys were tapping there, but I just, as you were talking about, you know, the idea that education systems are built through inequality, not just inequality becoming an outcome. We've put our thoughts together on that in a paper that I put in the chat. The link is there, called Education and Racial Capitalism, where we try to spell out what exactly we mean by this, and not just talking about the Australian case, but looking at British colonialism more broadly. Now, I don't know if I am catching the gist of your, like the question part, but what struck me, what I got thinking about when listening to you is the importance of pluralism in all of this, right? So it's not about displacement. It's about understanding that we do live in a multicultural, multilingual, multi-faith and multi-ethnic existence. And so, I'm sure, I don't know if there are any scholars here of linguistics, and I'm certainly no expert on it, but it was really, one of the ideas around code switching was really profound to me, actually, as it made me reflect on all the different ways I code switch. Even though I can speak in so-called standard English, there are, the ways I speak at home and the ways I speak in different communities take on different codes. And I think one of the things that we need to really think about is where hierarchies emerge in all of this. And I think it's the hierarchical organizing of people that's the fundamental problem that is at this, from everything that I've talked about, and people meaning people and their languages and their cultures and their knowledges. So the pluralism without the hierarchy, can we get there? I don't know, that's an open question. I'm sorry I've ended again on a very intangible question, but I think that's at the heart of what I was thinking about when listening to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Arathi. So there are just two questions, and I think we are almost towards the end now. One question is, do you think, Arathi, because schools functions within this society and within this captivist society, and I look forward to read up on that paper that you've written. I was wondering, do you think until and unless some exchange value is added to the indigenous languages, sadly, in this market structure, given this, this instrumental view of education that most of the, people actually take with them, that unless that is done, it might not help as much to restore the prestige of the indigenous languages. That is question number one. And the question number two is, now, could you possibly model for us, or in one or two sentences, tell us, what do you think an inclusive education environment would look like, keeping in mind that the question of inclusivity at times also implies at times assimilation, like you try to make other people like you rather, because this is the way they can succeed. Over to you, both of these.
Okay. Actually, in the work on racial capitalism, what we argue for is not that there should be a kind of exchange market value accorded to Indigenous languages per se, but that we need to rethink the political and economic structures itself. So where capitalism is harmful in its hierarchic ordering of people and life, that's where the intervention needs to be made. Again, it is a big structural argument, but I think it's about opening that conversation, because rather than accepting the status quo. So that's where we've gone with that first question. And then to respond to your question about what inclusive education looks like, I think it's an education that recognizes and values one's full humanity, and so if we think about it like that, it cannot be assimilation, because assimilation is about denying that pluralism and the full colors of humanity, the rich diversity that we have as human beings. But it needs to operate in a way that brings people together, that is collective, and that it allows one to thrive and flourish with recognizing their full humanity. I'll stop there, but yeah.
Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you everyone for being here. Really delighted to listen in, and really very insightful talk. Thank you very much. Thank you very much everyone for being here. Have a great evening.
Yeah, thank you everybody. And feel free to, I'm on Twitter under Arathi or something like that. You can find me anyway if you'd like to keep in touch. I look forward to hearing more about all your work. So thank you.
We'll share the reading group link with all the students.
Wonderful.
ourselves also. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Take care.